Hello, and a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Benjamin Simmons, head of the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership Secretariat. I would like to sincerely thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Make a Green New Deal, Practical Lessons from Countries and Regions. Today's webinar has been jointly organized with the Korea Green Growth Trust Fund and the World Bank Group. This is the second event organized jointly with the Trust Fund and the World Bank, and I encourage you to watch our first event, which was recorded back in February. Can a donut help us recover from COVID-19? You can find the recording on any of the GGKP Knowledge platforms or our YouTube channel. Before we get started with today's webinar, a few words on the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership for those of you who may not be as familiar with the initiative. We are a global network of nearly 80 organizations now from the policy, business, and finance communities, all committed to working together to support a green economy transition. We do this through our 3 global knowledge platforms, the Green Policy Platform, the Green Finance Platform, and the Green Industry Platform. In addition, as many of you know, a few months ago, we launched the Green Forum. This is an online community space that provides an opportunity for experts to engage directly with one another through public discussion boards and groups. I encourage you to visit the Green Forum and also to consider joining the 13,000 other experts currently receiving our newsletter. You can do this by subscribing at ggkp.org/subscribe. Now, before introducing the moderator for today's event, I would just like to remind everyone that with our webinars, we always have very active and engaged discussions. So I encourage you to submit any questions and comments you might have during today's event by using the chat function. And of course, after the webinar, we'd appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete our survey. Finally, please note that the presentations, as well as a full recording of the webinar, will be available on our websites. Today, we are extremely fortunate to be joined by an impressive panel of global experts who will be exploring national and regional efforts to develop Green New Deals. And leading us through this discussion will be the moderator for today's event, Richard Damania, Chief Economist for the Sustainable Development Practice at the World Bank. Prior to taking on his role as Chief Economist, Richard worked in senior roles in the World Bank regional groups, including Africa, South Asia, and Latin America and Caribbean. He's also published over 100 papers in scientific journals and is a recognized global expert on issues relating to the environment, water, and the economy. I'm happy to say that Richard also serves as the World Bank representative on the GGKP Steering Committee. Richard, I am delighted to welcome you as the moderator for today's event and am pleased to turn the webinar over to you. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you so very much, Ben. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and a very, very warm welcome to this webinar. A few words before I introduce our extremely well-qualified speakers. Why this topic? Well, I think it's quite obvious to you all. 2020, it was a year like no other that we have ever experienced. Well over 3 million people dead and still counting, regrettably. 300 million plus infected, and it still keeps going up. For the first time in living memory, poverty has increased, economies are typically in deep recession, labor markets have been wrecked. We don't know when the recovery will come and how quickly it'll come. Yet we know and we suspect that much of this was avoidable because COVID-19, as we know, is a zoonotic disease which spread from animals to humans. And indeed, today, 70% of all emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. So we are beginning to feel the pressures of a planet under stress. And what it says to us quite loudly is that we don't just draw on nature, as we do, but we also dwell in nature, which means we need better stewardship of the environment that affects humanity, affects the economy, and indeed, no matter how crude we may wish to be about this, affects the productive capacity of the planet and of economies. So we know we can do better, and we know many countries have been trying to do better. We're going to hear the stories of trying to do better and forge a Green New Deal from 4 countries, from Korea, from Pakistan, from the EU, and from the United States. All very different, very diverse, but much to learn from the challenges, the progress, and the approaches from each. Different political economy, different levels of consensus. So what I now have the very great pleasure of doing is actually introducing our speakers. Then I will pose questions to them, And then, of course, the floor is open for question and answers, including through the chat box. So we will be led off in our discussion by Dr. Hyungna Ho from Korea. And Dr. Hyungna Ho is the chair of the advisory committee on the Korea Green New Deal, and she was appointed by the Ministry of Economy and Finance in Korea. She's also, of course, an academic. She's a professor of economics in the College of International Studies at Kyunghee University, and her expertise is in climate change and in environmental economics. That, by the way, is also my background. So it's wonderful to have Dr. Ho here with us. Prior to this current role, Dr. Ho served on the Korea Development Institute and was an assistant professor at the West Virginia University. Dr. Ho will be followed by Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, who's had a really distinguished career. And I'm not going to be able to list all the things that Dr. Akhtar has done. So just very briefly, at the moment, Dr. Akhtar is the Executive Secretary, the UN Economic and Social Commission of Asia and the Pacific. She was previously former governor of the Central Bank of Pakistan. She serves as the Under Secretary General in the UN, was the 10th Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, and has done very many good and important things. Indeed, so much so that the Wall Street Journal has recognized her as one of the most influential women in Asia. And indeed, I have to say that Dr. Akhtar also once served as the Vice President of the Middle East and North Africa region in the World Bank. That would be followed by Mr. Greg Carlock, who is the Manager for Climate Action and Data in the World Resources Institute. And we will hear about what's happening in the United States with a very different political economy and a very different sets of opportunities and constraints. Greg Carlock is very well qualified to talk about this. He's Manager of Climate Action and Data at the World Resource Institute, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. He leads work on analyzing federal policy for deep decarbonization in the United States. He has also previously led work on the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and he's worked with a series of online tools and is, of course, very familiar with all the challenges that we face. With that, I would like to start off our session and perhaps ask our panelists to turn their camera on and pose to them and ask them to all address a key question. What are the elements of a comprehensive Green New Deal that you see in your countries? And let's start with Dr. Ho. So Dr. Ho, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Dr. Akhtar and then to Mr. Carlock. Dr. Ho, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can I briefly introduce the Korean Green New Deal first? Or should I go with the...
Please do.
Thank you, Dr. Damania, for introducing me so nicely. I would also like to express my gratitude to all organizers of this webinar meeting, including Korea's Green Growth Trust Fund and the World Bank and the Green Growth Knowledge Platform for inviting me to this meaningful event. Let me introduce the Korean New Deal very briefly. As you are aware, the Korean government has announced this Green New Deal last year, followed by 2050 carbon neutrality pledge. Since then, it has been a central part of the Korean economic policy. The Korean New Deal is proposed as a plan to accelerate the low carbonization of Korea's economy. In the short run, it targets to create 659,000 jobs by 2025. In order to achieve these dual goals, the government plans to invest approximately $67 billion for 5 years. As the net zero by 2050 goal has been added, the size of a public climate fund will increase, and a new climate fund is expected to be established soon. And as to where this public climate fund is invested, the 3 major target areas of green investments are suggested. The first two, the green transformation of urban space and living infrastructure, And next, sectors related to energy transition, including expanding the renewable energy on a large scale and expanding the market for EV cars or hydrogen fuel cell EV cars. And finally, the fostering R&D investment on green technologies will be the third part. And the government is open to the cooperation with the private sector or other countries in these R&D activities. So I would like to emphasize the private sector participation. In Korea, the more than 100 financial institutes have made a pledge to adopt sustainability or carbon neutrality as a key criterion in determining their investment decision and get actively involved in climate financing, including climate and green bond. We have the Korean pension fund, and usually it is very conservative. And now I expect it is also slowly moving toward the green wave. And private sector firms in the manufacturing sector are also very active in green transition. For example, the SK, POSCO, and Samsung and other big companies are very interested in R&D, RE100 or ESG management. And they plan to establish a climate-friendly global value chain and to issue ESG fund. As they are already global, they will contribute toward increasing climate investment domestically or internationally. The last point is the leadership of the central government. The Korean government has put effort in stimulating these changes. The carbon pricing with a K emission trading scheme started in 2015, and carbon taxes which are under consideration at this moment, and a leadership to deliver the Green New Deal and a carbon neutrality pledge, although they're facing quite burdensome barriers and obstacles. And the Korean version of green taxonomy have formed a field for expansion of the private sector participation into climate financing. So those are the very brief introduction of a Korean Green New Deal. And since I think I spent almost 3 minutes, so when everybody finished their the discussion on the question raised by Damania, and if I have a chance, I will go back to this topic again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ho. Dr. Akhtar, now the floor is yours. Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening in terms of Pakistan, in terms of building better, a greener deal, and trying to address some of the problems? Please, it's over to you.
So, thank you to all of you. Richard, thank you for the introduction. I think Korea is a great example of how green growth has been driven there. Pakistan, as you know, like every other country now, after COVID-19 crisis, there has been a growing recognition that green recovery is critical for lifting growth, inclusivity, and sustainability. And of course, there have been calls for building back better to nurture climate neutral and resilient infrastructure to protect the ecosystem and societal interests and generate the much needed jobs eventually. To safeguard lives and livelihood, Pakistan has offered, like other countries, fiscal and monetary stimulus, along with the support of financing from MDBs that has been quite critical. And as you know, G20 debt service suspension has helped to revive economic activity and has a great potential to help in reviving or setting on course the green financing. Pakistan ranks 5th in terms of climate vulnerability index, even though its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is relatively low. Pakistan is now in process of revising its national NDC contributions. It, however, has originally committed to reduce by up to 20% of its projected greenhouse emission under the business as usual scenario by 2030. But that's subject to availability of international assistance to meet the total abatement cost of close to 40 billion at 2016 prices. Pakistan, unfortunately, has not been a major beneficiary of international climate or green finance, I believe. The government has championed a set of new initiatives which are likely to be game changer, we hope, and hopefully it would provide the right blend of official green and climate financing. Let me talk about 6 odd initiatives that have gained momentum. First, there is a 10 billion tree tsunami project, which has been structured to enhance countrywide forest and tree coverage for carbon sequestration, biodiversity protection by adopting ecosystem-based approaches. Besides generating 65,000 jobs last year, with now the expansion plan, it has potential to scale new jobs to 200,000. Hopefully, these daily wages will be reemployed and they will be nurturing plant, nursery care, natural forest, and firefighting. A second important initiative related to this is the Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, which is structured with public-private support, provides 180 million, supported by 180 million multilateral assistance led by World Bank for tree plantation and ecological preservation of the 15 national parks to protect areas coverage by 50%. This initiative, which mainstreams mitigation and adaptation initiatives for environmental resilience of the countries, targeting forestation, biodiversity conservation, and policy formulation in line with emerging NDCs, as well as attaining land degradation neutrality, therein restoring about 30% of degraded forest, upgrading 23 national parks, and restoring 5% of degraded cropland, and so on and so forth. There's also a protected areas initiatives to develop 15 model protected areas across country. These illustrations are simply to make the point that a lot of new things are happening. On the financing side, what is very innovative is a proposal that has now been submitted to bilateral creditors to support debt for nature swap scheme, which could see debt relief from few creditors in return for binding commitments to achieve ecosystem preservation targets. Finance for Biodiversity is working with our Ministry of Climate Change to structure a nature performance bond linking debt retirement with quantifiable performance on biodiversity. A fifth, very first initiative of its kind is the Green Eurobond of 500 million, which is going to be financing WAPDA's hydroelectric plant. We also have in 2019 issued a new renewable energy policy, hopefully to get to 20% mix by 2025 to be raised to 30%. There are lots of other initiatives, but in interest of time, I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akhtar. Before I hand the floor over to Greg, it's wonderful to hear the way in which conventional climate actions are being merged with those of biodiversity, ecosystem protection, and harnessing the power of nature in solutions and creating jobs. Now, Greg, the floor is yours. Please tell us about the United States, what's happening. It's all very, very different cases, and we will try to draw some lessons at the end.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. I first want to thank the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership for the invitation to speak today, and certainly say it's a pleasure to be joining all of the panelists and the audience today. So my name is Greg Carlock, and I do work on climate action and decarbonization in the United States at World Resources Institute. And in addition to the background that Richard provided, and certainly out of full transparency, I wanted to share that I was also involved in crafting the first comprehensive Green New Deal framework for the United States back in 2018, and did serve on the Biden-Harris presidential transition team on climate and environmental issues. So got to get some firsthand look on some of the priorities of the administration that I'll be speaking to today. But that was in a volunteer capacity, and I still work at WRI at the moment. So given the tumultuous past several years in the United States, I thought it was important to provide some of that historical context of kind of where Green New Deal energy is moving and kind of what it's transformed into in the United States and what we hope to see coming soon. Because the Green New Deal is certainly a term and a movement that originated in the United States around 2018, inspired by the kind of 1930s, 1940s New Deal era of the United States in response to the Great Depression. But we should certainly acknowledge that the principles underpinning that movement undoubtedly emerged decades before in both domestic and international environmental and sustainable development spaces. I think it was just kind of a unique manifestation to mobilize the United States coalitions towards ambitious climate action, which is why I want to distinguish the term Green New Deal from its intent, because like most things in the United States, it has been met both with kind of this definitional territoriality of what is it, as well as toxic partisanship, which is one of the kind of key barriers that we still face within the United States around ambitious climate action. So you could identify the Green New Deal in the United States as the framework proposed by U.S. legislator Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and promoted by the youth movements and other groups within this country. There are detailed legislative proposals like then presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, and some of the what I would call Green New Deal adjacent proposals by other candidates at the time, including Joe Biden. And then there is this fictional effigy that was propped up by the opponents of the Green New Deal that cast it as a restriction of individual freedom that will bankrupt the economy and make everybody's lives worse and ban meat and things like that. And it sounds silly, but those are real forces that we're working against in the United States. So that 2-year evolution of the idea in the United States caused the term to fade somewhat in US politics, but the aspects, I think it's important to note, persist and are very much represented in what Congress is looking at and what is in the President Biden's agenda to what he now phrases as Build Back Better, which has also been kind of an internationally accepted motto for this post-pandemic period. So as a prelude to the panel discussion, I do want to quickly highlight where I think the U.S. is moving along 3 dimensions, shared within the U.S. trajectory and the Green New Deal, and that's climate, jobs, and justice. And so on climate, the Biden administration has begun to work quickly to reverse many of the setbacks of the previous administration, and namely pushing to rejoin to the Paris Agreement, enhancing its NDC ambition with a new national commitment of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030, as a stepping stone towards net zero emissions by 2050. And certainly reasonable people can view that as not a fair share of emission reductions given the historical contribution to emissions. But I think there's also an acknowledgement of what is technically and politically feasible, in the near term to make real progress on US emissions without sliding back again. To accomplish this, the administration has promoting things like a clean electricity standard, rapidly electrifying and improving the efficiency of buildings and vehicles, investing in that research and innovation space to get at those harder to abate sectors in industry and aviation. There's been using power of the executive branch to point the federal government towards the crisis, addressing climate risk disclosure within the financial sector, and also promoting a lot of investment in community and national resilience. And that also includes kind of the land and watershed restoration in light of many of the severe weather-related disasters that the United States has experienced over the past several years. It's the hurricanes, it's the floods, it's the wildfires, which I'm sure the air quality issues are something shared by a lot of other communities around the world on these issues. And so last on the kind of climate, in fact, we have estimated at WRI that about 50% of the Biden administration's American Jobs Plan, which is a big infrastructure and economic spending proposal, about $2 trillion or less, depending on how it gets negotiated, is actually targeting clean and green spending, which is one of the kind of largest shares that we've seen proposed. So if that level of funding comes to fruition, that's going to be a great down payment on a lot of the infrastructure necessary. It's going to make this Green New Deal happen within the United States. So that brings us to jobs. And in a country where our manufacturing sector has been in steady decline for decades, I think the administration, like many of us, recognizes the global economic opportunity that's available to us in a transition to a clean and green economy. That the only way to address climate change is to build our way out of it. And that's building and deploying the low carbon technology, building sustainable resilient infrastructure to protect communities, to support specific communities in their transition away from fossil fuels. And that comes with, we have a strong kind of labor coalition in this country. And so while defining that means defining job quality standards so that workers are protected, earn fair and prevailing wages, and can build wealth and kind of tackle that third prong of income inequality under this. So that brings us to the third, which is justice. And the Biden administration has been very vocal about its commitment to keep justice and community voices at the center of this recovery, bringing them into the conversation and hoping that that's a dynamic that persists throughout this whole process and isn't pushed aside, as has been seen in the past. And that includes a commitment of 40% of benefits of clean energy investments and recovery investments going to historically disadvantaged communities and communities that are transitioning away from the fossil fuel economy. And the fourth kind of bonus area is this recognizing this unique role of both getting our house in order and the international leadership that's expected out of the United States. And I think what we're seeing is early phases of re-engaging with the world. And I think there's more to be seen there, particularly as we work towards Glasgow about the role of and the opportunity to engage more with the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund to help other countries that are trying to put forth their own Green New Deal. So this is all early movement, and it's not everything that can be done in the United States, and accomplishing it faces many real challenges, both procedural and political, but they'll also be complemented by a lot of subnational action in cities and states across the United States. So I look forward to getting into some of those details further in the discussion. So thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you so much, Greg. That's fascinating, and we live in hope, right, that there is success and considerable movement. And last but not least, let me introduce our last panelist. It's Davor, but not least indeed. Davor Percan. Davor joins us from the European Commission, which in many ways, and not in many ways, has in fact spearheaded an attempts at a green recovery. And Davor's head of the unit in the DG of Environment comes with a background in energy. Let me not waste time and chew into your time, Davor. Please, can you give us a brief 3 to 5 minutes outline of the European Commission's Green New Deal, the attempts, the aspirations, and where we are right now in terms of achieving those goals? The floor is yours, Davor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me first and foremost, and apologies, there have been some technical issues with the connection, but thanks to your colleagues, this was all sorted out very smoothly. So very happy to be with you today here. It's a pleasure and a privilege to give you a brief outline of our Green New Deal, which is basically a comprehensive action plan that was, as you said, that is spearheaded by the Commission. But it is, in fact, if I would have to summarize it in 3 to 5 points over 5 minutes, I think the key thing is that this is the EU's growth strategy. So it is a comprehensive set of measures that go across the board, so do not involve only environmental and climate measures, but it is a comprehensive growth strategy with the aim of transforming the Union into a modern, resource efficient and competitive economy, where there are no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, where economic development is decoupled from resource use, and which has a strong social element through which no person and no place is left behind. I think another key element of the European Green Deal is that it is a whole of government, a whole of the economy strategy, So it spans. It is not limited only to certain sectors. It encompasses absolutely every sector across the economy, and it involves all of the administration. A third point, which I think is very important, is that it goes beyond just a single objective, such as, for example, I don't know, climate action or employment or pollution or food systems. It goes beyond that, and it encompasses a systemic approach. It recognizes that the multitude of changes we're facing today, that we're facing today are interdependent, and that we will not achieve our goals and live within planetary boundaries if we just focus on one specific objective or one specific planetary challenge, as pertinent as it may be. And lastly, I would like to say that a key point is that it is a strategy. It is a set of measures which are endorsed by the EU citizens. They are demanded by citizens. They're demanded by our young generations, by our future generations. They are endorsed by the governments of all 27 member states. So there is a consensus at a political level and at the level of the EU citizens that this is the right way forward. And I'm looking forward to a discussion where I'll be able to tell you a little bit more about the elements that make up the EU's Green Deal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ho, let's turn to you now for the next question. Well, really, what has contributed to the success, and what are the major constraints that you are seeing in Korea to taking this agenda forward? And just drawing from a question in the chat box, for all of the speakers in answering that question, if you could opine a little bit and tell us what you see as the role of the private sector in all of this. You know, what role do you see the private sector playing in trying to loosen some of the binding constraints we have in taking forward the agenda? The floor is yours, Dr. O.
Okay, I think I cannot say at this moment that our plan of Green New Deal is already successful, because we have some the obstacles. I think the most important one is our natural or the geographic condition to generate renewable energy. So we are like, in terms of power grid, it's like our power system is like an island. And that means we are quite vulnerable to a large portion of renewable energy. And also our natural or geographical condition makes the producing renewable energy is quite costly. That means the transition cost is relatively higher than that of other countries. And also our economy is based on cost at the carbon intensive and export driven manufacturing sectors. It is the economy's merit, because you know during the COVID-19 our economic system or structure shows a big competitiveness in the international market, but it is also brings some burdens on Green New Deal, because when we try to decarbonize the manufacturing sector, and we have to use the hydrogen energy, which is really costly, and also the CCUS is really the costly measure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That means in order to they make a transition from the current economic structure to the low carbon and climate resilient economy, we need a really big size of climate finance. So I don't think the government can provide the 100% of climate financing which is needed to achieve the 2050 carbon neutrality goal. So the private sector participation is really important. And also the risk is also a kind of opportunity for us, because our major market is United States, China, and EU, and occasionally they made a pledge toward 2050 carbon neutrality or 2060 carbon neutrality. That means in order to maintain the current level of exports, our manufacturing sector needed to be decarbonized very quickly. So the private sector are very active in adopting new technologies or low carbonization technologies. So it will increase the probability that, of the Green New Deal becomes successful. So in the other elements I'd like to emphasize is the vision which is provided by the government. So the government says that this is not the way. We cannot survive in this the new market environment. So we have to make a new direction. So I think the public's perception is a little bit better than before, but we have a target and we have the current point, but the path, which is based on scientific analysis, is not quite clear or the transparent. So one question which is related to private sector participation, I think I already made some hints, because that we again that we have some losers and winners in the manufacturing sector, and we already saw the winners in this new region, like LG batteries. They made a big revenues when the EV market or EV market size has increased. So showing those reference cases are really important for the private sector to make a decision. Again, so the question is like in terms of determining or the predicting whether the Korean Green New Deal becomes a successful, I think that depends on the possibility to raise the climate finance from the private sector. So again, that they start to move, and in that sense, I'm quite positive. And one question is related to job estimates, and the government's I believe, frankly speaking, I don't know the details, but the government has the number of the target jobs, and I think it is based on the international estimates provided by IEA or other international organizations. But the Korean government conducted some research to reevaluate that number and how to create those number of jobs based on input-output analysis or CGE models at this moment. Yeah, that's all.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Dr. Akhtar, let's turn to you. So what has contributed to success and what have been the hurdles? And if you don't mind, if it's possible, Dr. Akhtar, tell us a little bit, and there was a question in the chat box, about what about cleaner production? We have a very, very impressive array of ecosystem restoration efforts that you outlined, but is there any attention being given to cleaner production? And just as a heads up there, well, we can come to you and say, is there any thinking on the carbon border adjustments? Because that would make Dr. Akhtar's life a lot easier if that were to happen in terms of the incentive structure. Dr. Akhtar, it's over to you. Dr. Akhtar, you're still muted. Yeah, now
yes.
You're open.
Now I'm unmuted. I think it's important to recognize that worldwide private sector is now playing a very important role in the production of in the production process. So ultimately, it will be in the hands of the private sector to lead the path towards zero emissions or carbon neutrality, if one can put it that way. Of course, the public policy plays a very important role in this arena, and I would not say that we have in Pakistan achieved the right mix of balance on that frontier for the private sector, or for that matter, the private sector knows it all on how to go forward. But there are some new attempts that are now being made. First of all, I think it's important that there is a proactive debate where we empower the citizens to seek access to production as well as the services that will ultimately generate what I would call a clean energy Pakistan. And there, the role of the volunteers is growing now. They are being registered as clean energy champions, and they have played a role in the COVID-19 prevention in Pakistan, whether it's related to hygiene, sanitation, solid waste management, safe drinking water, etc. So that's like, I would say, that combined with the grassroots movement, which comes with an awareness, which comes with an understanding. And as the pressure builds on that frontier, the behavior of the companies is going to change. Now, that is a larger wave that's needed in all the developing countries. Abstracting from that, the bigger companies that are more resourceful in Pakistan are embracing basically sustainability as a core area within their businesses. Affordable understanding of how you transform your business. For instance, I can give you an example of the Angro company, which is one of the leading fertilizer production, but it's a holding company, so it has a number of other production chains, has now enhanced its investment into sustainability. They have launched a new model of for the company to assess what would make a difference on sustainability. Now, this is related to one of their businesses, fertilizer, and they are the largest fertilizer production company, and as you know, that would make a difference if they were to get. A second example I can give is the export-oriented industry, where the pressure is coming from across the borders. So when other countries are exporting products from developing countries, or for that matter from Pakistan, they are demanding a certain mix of menu, like, you know, the environment, the social safeguards, the governance reporting, and that is also bringing in a huge amount of momentum. I'm involved in an initiative called the Pakistan Environment Trust Fund, where we are going to be working with 40 industrial entities, and we will be working to look into some of those elements with those companies. So it's a combination of all that. And one final thing is also trying to make sure people understand the ESG part of it, and not all corporates have as yet understood that. So I am now affiliated with the Pakistan Institute of Corporate Governance as well as the Pakistan Stock Exchange, and we plan to launch the ESG index and then get the companies assessed on the basis of that. So those are some small endeavors that are in the pipeline. Of course, the big thing that will make a difference is the renewable energy transition shift, on which I have already mentioned that there is a policy proposal there and an attempt is being made. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akhtar. No, that's absolutely true. It's very impressive to hear that, and there are certainly serious efforts to shift the energy as well as the clean production. Greg, let's move over to you now. And as you can see from the chat box, there's also a question, if you don't mind, while addressing it, is the fact of polarization, the fact that unlike the European Union, there doesn't seem to be as much unanimity across the United States for some of these agenda items. So In talking about the opportunities, the constraints, the way forward, the instruments, just very quickly, we're beginning to run out of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of both hurdles and things that have contributed, factors that have contributed to success, I want to speak to both the politics and the technology. I think one of the most important things to recognize about what the Green New Deal did in the United States was to force a conversation that wasn't being had. It was to recognize that Congress had no comprehensive climate plan, and that as we were approaching a presidential election, that there was a sizable political movement gathering to build pressure and to mobilize voters. And in the United States, those types of things carry weight, both whether it's coming from the private sector or whether it's kind of coming from the populace. Because climate policy in the United States had been successfully politicized for decades, that politicians either kind of stayed away from it or filtered it through these different types of lenses about economic opportunity or clean energy. And then the Green New Deal created this interesting narrative reversal where when we first tried to sell climate action, we, the researchers, tried to sell climate action on its own merits. Then we said it's great for jobs and great for equity too. But what the Green New Deal did was flip it to recognize that if you have to fix the structural injustice within the economy if you're going to fix climate change too. It recognized that the economy that gives us pollution and climate change is the same economy that breeds inequality, environmental and economic injustice. And that's what gave us the coalition, the political coalition, the grassroots coalition. And coalitions are tenuous. And so that was both an important successful factor, but also a risk, because we have to keep that coalition together for as long as we can in order to get as much as we can. And the fracturing of that coalition is what will undermine, the infrastructure bills and the climate aggressive climate policies and the economic recovery. And so there, I would say that there actually is a very large and strong coalition that did help bring Joe Biden into power and the Democratic Congress that we have into power. But it is a tenuous one. And so that kind of brings us to one of the hurdles on the political side, which is just these entrenched interests. We are a fossil fuel country, not just in terms of many of the oil majors and petroleum companies and coal producers, et cetera. But we just run on fossil fuels. Our homes and our vehicles run on fossil fuels, and we use all the chemicals that come from that industry. And if the colonial pipeline hack, if you're familiar with it in the United States, it shows us anything, the transition off of fossil fuels must be a managed one. And so there's going to be a lot of entrenched fear that we have to get over. But that brings us to the opportunity, which is that these entrenched interests are moving more and more towards clean energy. And I think that's a role of the private sector that can play, is where they are getting, and I'm not just talking about the Teslas of the world, the flashy companies that get a lot of attention, but there are significantly more larger clean energy companies and companies that manufacture relevant equipment that have a bigger political stake and can use that political weight to move legislatures. And that's just a reality of our politics, where money matters and votes matter. And so you have to kind of move the money and move the voters. And I think the last thing I want to say about, well, quickly, I do want to add on the politics. There is a very thin margin of democratic control in the United States right now, and that means you're threading very fine needles of what you can do with kind of a split control there, with two different chambers and one that has kind of shared control. And so there's a number of both budgetary items that we can do, as well as kind of new programmatic things that require what we call bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans. But then the last thing I want to add about kind of the boons to what we're doing is just that the technology is getting cheaper and better. And we are a consumer-driven country, and there are definitely reasons we want to move away from intense consumption. But in this instance, when we are trying to upgrade vehicles, upgrade homes, and get the low-carbon technology out there, we're definitely seeing the confluence of important subsidies and just falling technology costs and comfort and familiarity with technology is going to help accelerate that transition.
Thank you so much. I think your last point is so important. You know, policy will follow and the private sector will follow when the incentives actually occur, and technology can play a key role in making cleaner production so much cheaper. Can we move now to the EU? And if it's at all possible, if you could update us on, is there any movement, anything we know and can learn about the carbon border adjustment? Is that going to happen? Is it not going to happen? And what are the hurdles, and where do you see you've actually succeeded so far?
Well, first of all, I think that the European Green Deal and what we're trying to do in Europe, and what we're largely succeeding on doing through the green transition, should not be equated or should not be seen through the prism of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I think that is one aspect that understandably has gained some traction in the media and amongst businesses, but I think that's not one of the main points. So what we're trying to do is prevent carbon leakages. And I think to understand fully the carbon border adjustment mechanism, we need to be aware of one major principle of the environmental and existential crisis that we're facing as human beings inhabiting planet Earth, and that is that our problems are global problems. So we are from literally the four corners of the world gathered here today because we share many of the same challenges, we share many of the same solutions. So I can relate very much to what any of the panelists here has said, and that from that comes out one of the main principles that we also subscribe to in the Green Deal, and that is that global action is needed. So we will not solve our problems if we do certain things in the EU, colleagues do certain things in Korea, things are done in Pakistan and the US. But even if everything is done in terms of climate neutrality, then we still will have problems on our shoulders. So in that way, what we want to do is also prove that there can, one of the main postulates of economics, that there can be no free meals. And that if certain rules are valid and are made for the benefit of our future and of our societies in the European Union, then we must also ensure that there are measures that prevent the circumventing of these rules and carbon leakage from markets where rules are different. I think this is in the interest of all of us as human beings, because, as I said, these challenges are common for all of us. The proposal has not yet been finalized. We are working on it. We're still fine-tuning the mechanism. But as I said, I would not like the humongous efforts that are being done by the citizens and by the governments to be sort of overshadowed by a mechanism which is by no means intended to be protectionist or in any way hampering international trade. Its intent is to set us all on a global goal which we have committed to, and that is carbon and climate neutrality.
Thank you so much. That was very, very well put. And indeed, this is a wicked problem that we're dealing with. And one of the wicked aspects of it is without the international coordination, we simply don't succeed. So small or big, we all have to play our part. We have very little time. In fact, we have only 3 minutes left. So can I just go around the table, the virtual table, and 1 minute? Oh, we know there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. How do we handle the losers in any transition that we have? Is there something you're seeing in your countries where you're working, something that's worked or has potential you'd like to tell us about? And please be brief. We have only 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Dr. O, would you like to just give us 30 seconds?
Yes. I conducted the research on just transition mechanism in Korea, and I think the most important thing, compared to the mitigation effort, the outcome or the performance of just the transition mechanism is not easy to measure. So there is no clear link between inputs and outputs. So usually the local governments or the countries which is highly impacted by the climate change, that means they have a possibility to be a loser. They usually don't have the capacity to make the regional JTM mechanism or find the right solution. So the central government's supports, the financial or the technical supports is needed, and also when they set the criteria, I think the engagement of various stakeholders, including labor union in that region, and the matching fund, like the local financial private sector involvement in the just transition mechanism is a key element to make the just transition mechanism be successful. So I want to stop here.
Great. Okay, look, thank you. Look, we're just about out of time, so I won't hand the floor over to others because I'm sure we will run out of time. Thank you so much. Agree, Dr. Ho, that we need a coalition, you know, in terms of all of the different parties in order to get a just transition. These are difficult problems, but I think we are seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully at the end of all of this, we come about with a much, much better world. I mean, in many ways, the world has succeeded economically, but we have failed environmentally generally. I think we can all agree on that. And now the challenge going forward is to succeed both economically, make sure people are better off, they have jobs, they have good jobs, but not at the cost of the whole planet and everything crashing in front of us. And I think we're beginning to see light, and we're beginning to see convergence in many elements, and the challenge is to keep this going forward. So I would like to end by thanking our speakers. We've learned an awful lot, and you've given us a lot to hope about and show us the way forward in very different circumstances. Thank you very much for that. I would also very much like to thank the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership. Without them, we wouldn't be here. And I would also finally like to acknowledge and thank very much the Korean Green Growth Trust Funds and our colleagues in Korea, who actually were the catalysts for this idea and for this particular webinar that we actually have. It actually emerged from the work that was happening in Korea. And what could be really better to bring countries and circumstances that are so different to talk about a common problem that all of humanity and the globe faces. So with that, and to our audience, thank you for joining us. And to our speakers, thank you so much for spending the time. It's been late for some of you, early for some others of you. Thank you. Have a good day, have a good afternoon, and a good evening. Goodbye, everyone.